Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Well, as Pope Benedict's death continues to hit us and we continue to process what has actually happened, of course, there are many opinions circulating around the internet, and I'm not saying that's good or bad, it's just what's happening. And one of them is actually from Rod Dreher. If you don't know who he is apostate Catholic. He was a Catholic and then left the church. I believe he's Eastern Orthodox now. That aside, he is an excellent author, objectively speaking. I don't agree with all of his positions. Many of them I don't agree with. However, he's just a good author and interesting, insightful journalist. And he wrote an article opining about the legacy of Pope Benedict and whether or not that had something to do with Fatima. What he wrote was the following. He said, "It's very easy to understand the anger of Catholics suffering from Francis's papacy. But if I were still Catholic, I would likely share it. But I wonder if Benedict understood something about his mission that the rest of us don't. I heard from a priest friend this morning a theory that Benedict's mission was to suffer on behalf of the Church, to suffer from the Church. That Benedict, not John Paul II, is the Pope of the third secret of Fatima. That somehow in his renunciation and subsequent humiliation and abuse, Joseph Ratzinger played a mystical role in the drama of salvation, especially as the drama reaches a crescendo with the approaching great apostasy of the West." Needless to say, that's a pretty fascinating statement. And in fact, there's a lot to it. And in order to understand that, we're actually going to look at what the third secret of Fatima says. Well, at least what we know it says, because there's obviously controversy about whether or not it's all been revealed. But we're going to look at that and see if there is something in there that actually applies to Benedict. So here is what is released about the third secret of Fatima according to the Vatican website. And it says the following: "After the two parts which I have already explained, at the left of Our Lady and a little above, we saw an angel with a flaming sword in his left hand, flashing. It gave out flames that looked as though they would set the world on fire, but they died out in contact with the splendor that Our Lady radiated towards him from her right hand. Pointing to the earth with his right hand, the angel cried out in a loud voice, 'Penance, penance, penance!' And we saw an immense light that is God, something similar to how people appear in a mirror when they pass in front of it. A bishop dressed in white. We had the impression that it was the Holy Father. Other bishops, priests, men and women religious going up a steep mountain at the top of which there was a big cross of rough-hewn trunks, as of cork tree with the bark. Before reaching there, the Holy Father passed through a big city half in ruins and half trembling with halting step, afflicted with pain and sorrow. He prayed for the souls of the corpses he met on his way. Having reached the top of the mountain, on his knees at the foot of the cross, he was killed by a group of soldiers who fired bullets and arrows at him. And in the same way there died one after another the other bishops, priests, men and women religious, and various lay people of different ranks and positions. Beneath the two arms of the cross, there were two angels, each with a crystal aspersorium in his hand, in which they gathered up the blood of the martyrs, and with it sprinkled the souls that were making their way to God." Now, of course, there's a ton there. There are 1,000,001 ways to interpret the third secret of Fatima, and that's a controversy that I'm not set to get into in the scope of this video. But one thing that I find fascinating is that it says in there, it mentions a bishop dressed in white. And then it also mentions the Holy Father. Now, is there a distinction made in the writing of Sister Lucy there about what happened with Our Lady of Fatima? Is she saying that there is a bishop dressed in white, which usually would be seen as the Holy Father, hence why she says we had the impression that it was the Holy Father? And is there then another man who is the Holy Father? I have no idea. But it is interesting that she wrote, we had the impression that it was the Holy Father. And I will say this, Pope Benedict, now we don't have to call him Pope Emeritus, as he was the Pope of the Catholic Church for a time and he has died. It's a title that he retains. He's Pope Benedict, who died. But it is possible that this vision is referring to a time of great sorrow and calamity within the church, where there's a man who's dressed in white, giving the impression that he's the Pope, and there's also the Pope. I don't know, but I think it's fascinating. Now, one thing I do like about this interpretation or statement here from Rod Dreher, is that often in sort of the mainstream arm of the church, when interpreting, I should say by many in the mainstream arm, I'm not sure what they all think, but by many in the sort of mainstream arm of the church, church media talking about the third secret of Fatima, there's often this insistence that it was Pope John Paul II, who was this bishop dressed in white, who was this pope, evidenced, they say, by the fact that there was an assassination attempt against his life back in the 1980s, and that this somehow makes him the fulfillment of this idea that the Pope would be assassinated. There's a few problems with this. For one, he wasn't assassinated. So if it's a prophecy that's not conditional, then that doesn't work. Also, there's a lot more to it than just, an assassination attempt. There are tons of arrows being shot and so on and so forth. But that actually personally leads me to see it as metaphorical. Much like when we read the book of the Apocalypse, it describes a type of warfare that's going to happen at the end of time. But lots of the weapons of war that are used in the older literature, we don't use those anymore. So are we to believe that there must be arrows? I have no idea. But usually prophecies end up being more metaphorical than literal. Doesn't mean they're any less true, but they get to a deeper meaning, a spiritual reality. The third secret also has been said to have been about the Second Vatican Council. This idea that there's just this Rome is in ruins and there's this terrible calamity and the popes are ridiculed as a result. That's an interpretation as well. So ultimately, we don't know exactly. But there's one more thing that I want to touch on here when it comes to the life of Pope Benedict and the errors of Russia and the prophecies of Fatima about the errors of Russia. There are many different errors of Russia in the historical sense. Communism did not originate in Russia, but we can say that there was an aspect of the Soviet Union spreading communism around the world to an alarming degree. However, it's plural. It's errors of Russia. I believe one of those that came out of atheistic communism was the spread of evolutionism, which to that point in history had not been spread so succinctly as it was by the atheist materialist communists. But another error that is common in the Russian story is the error of schism. And I'm talking about real schism here, not the New Church left Cath use of the word schism for everyone they disagree with. They use the word schism like leftists use the word racism. It means nothing the way they use it. But I'm talking about real schism. And if there are any Orthodox believers watching, please let me explain myself before it seems like I'm accusing the East of something. Just for a moment. Even if it could be argued that really it's the West, it's the Latin Church that has basically separated itself from communion with the East. It's kind of our fault. Let's just argue that for a second. It has to be admitted that in the East, in the Russian Orthodox Church, or in the East and with the Russian Orthodox Church, there have been numerous schisms and excommunications that continue to this day. And there seems to be this continual error of schism, this continual divorce of one communion from another. And this happens, as I said, all the time. Now, it says in the warnings about Fatima that the errors of Russia will spread. Well, if Pope Benedict is the Fatima Pope or is a fulfillment to this prophecy in some way, personally, I think he was a pope who did a lot to try to end any potential schisms. And in the wake of his death, it's been very clear that for whatever reason, it's bringing out the worst in people. I did a video on how Matt Fradd and Pints with Aquinas are out there screaming at, internet screaming at people who thought Benedict was the Pope and calling them schismatics. Patrick Coffin, who is a Benedict, is Pope. Benedict was still Pope believer. Replied to a comment that someone wrote about me or to me on social media about the Society of St. Pius X. And here is Pat Coffin, who's being called a schismatic by, the sort of mainstream hipster church establishment. And he says, the SSPX, he called it schism land. Anyway, I see, the German bishops have been on the brink of schism. Personally, I think that we're in for a bout of schism in the West. I think that's going to be the errors of Russia spreading. Now, What does it have to do with the consecration of Pope Francis, of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary by Pope Francis? That's another conversation for another day. But just my thoughts on the matter. This has been the Kennedy Report. Until next time, God bless.